What do the number of lights on at the Pentagon, location of church leaders, the quantity of stocks in blood banks, and a computer in Moscow have in common? Nuclear war. During the 1980s, paranoia, military escalation, and computer science all helped contribute to nearly turning the Cold War hot. This is the story of Operation Ryan, history you didn't know. The Cold War, which lasted over 70 years, pitted the world's two and only nuclear alliances against each other and brought us close to nuclear annihilation on multiple occasions. As NATO and the Warsaw Pact sat watching each other, each side wanted to ensure that they would end up on top of the irradiated rubble should the unthinkable occur. Through the decades, many ideas, schemes, and strategies were attempted, and for the Soviet Union, Operation Ryan was seen by some as their best chance. Operation Ryan, which in English stands for nuclear missile attack, was the largest peacetime intelligence operation in the history of the Soviet Union. Leading into the 1980s, paranoia on both sides seemed to be heightening, as they both believed the only chance to win a nuclear war was to be the ones to fire first. The question, however, was when to strike. For the Soviet Union, Ryan was the answer, and they combined computer technology with human intelligence to create a set of indicators to inform Soviet leaders of when to strike. While much of Ryan and how it worked is still classified to this day, scholars have managed to piece together the basics. Upon initiation in 1981, Warsaw Pact agents infiltrating NATO countries were ordered to gather information on areas of interest such as potential places of evacuation, shelter locations, stocks available in blood banks, the whereabouts of personnel from churches and banks, observations of nuclear sites, key military personnel, and military installations. A wide range of information was deemed important to Ryan, which even supposedly included the number of lights on at the Pentagon. Basically, agents were looking for a multitude of possible evidence that preparations for nuclear war were imminent. All this information would be input into a computer system which would provide to Soviet analysts a level of how likely a first strike from the West would be. Some have described the system as a large screen with a series of X's placed next to certain categories. As data was inserted, the X would light up by said categories, and the number of X's would indicate a probability of imminent attack. A threshold that is still unknown as to this day, but once this threshold was met, the recommendation would be to strike the West before they could react. Though we can only theorize what the threshold for first strike was, it is very possible that it was reached at least once during the fall of 1983, when once again, the world nearly faced nuclear annihilation at the hands of the world's greatest nuclear powers. Ryan as a program would continue without any major impact for some time until a confluence of factors and events would help lead to a possible near-nuclear crisis, where Ryan likely played an important role. First of these events was the accession of two leaders who both harbored paranoia and mistrust of each other's nations. Ronald Reagan, 40th President of the U.S., and Yuri Andropov, former head of the KGB and most recent General Secretary of the Soviet Union. Ryan took on new significance with the accession of Yuri Andropov. He would become increasingly paranoid about threats to the Soviet Union, and so gave Ryan a new sense of urgency, seeing it as an important tool. What was once seen as an ancillary intelligence operation now took on new importance in the defense of Russia and beyond. Stateside, President Reagan raised tensions with rhetoric and policy. He declared the Soviet Union the evil empire and took every opportunity during the beginning of his presidency to speak against them. With the stage set, a culmination of events would lead to a near-nuclear disaster. Under the president, America initiated its peace through strength policy, using military power as a deterrent to any possible threat of Soviet attack. Much of this would also serve to scare the Russians and increase paranoia. Military exercises and movements designed to show this strength, such as naval ships skirting or violating Soviet territory, contributed to this. Reagan also moved to deploy the Pershing II missile in Germany, on the doorstep of the Warsaw Pact. He also pushed forward the Strategic Defense Initiative, or otherwise known to history as Star Wars. It was essentially a program to defeat incoming Soviet missiles by creating a shield for NATO powers. These factors, military exercises, the Pershings, and the SDI, were a serious threat from the Soviet viewpoint. For them, the military movements showed a willingness of aggression, the Pershings exhibited an ability to attack quickly with little warning, and the SDI would allow the West to attack without fear of destruction. Taking this into consideration, the Russians were more paranoid and more determined to strike first should war come. In this atmosphere, Ryan would serve to confirm their worst fears. The purpose of Ryan was to take in evidence of nuclear attack and spit out a probability of war. Therefore, the intelligence being gathered by the Soviets on NATO's actions were being viewed through the lens of Ryan, which at this point was becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy of imminent attack. As Soviet leaders worried over possible nuclear annihilation, the West would help feed into this paranoia with a seemingly innocuous military exercise known as Able Archer 83. At this point, Ryan was probably close to or indicating the threshold for war. Able Archer would give them further evidence of a NATO nuclear attack, as during the exercise they would simulate this. The Soviet Union was not surprised by the exercise, as such things were common for both sides. They did, however, have a constant fear that such exercises would be a cover for a real invasion. Furthermore, during the exercise there would be certain errors made, like the word strike being used erroneously, or thousands of U.S. troops being flown from the U.S., but radio silent. Finally, combined with the paranoid atmosphere in the Kremlin fed by Ryan, and the part of the exercise preparing for simulated nuclear attack, alarms went off in the Soviet leadership. Soviet intelligence officers and leaders came to the conclusion that they were under threat. They reacted by putting forces in East Germany and Poland on alert in preparation for their own attack. They readied their nuclear arsenal, perhaps even loading these destructive weapons onto planes in preparation. It is likely that their state of alert went farther than we realized then or now. In the end, war was averted, possibly having to do more with luck than direct action. Lieutenant General Leonard H. Perutz, the Assistant Chief of Staff to the U.S. Air Force in Europe, was informed of increased Soviet readiness, but decided not to place NATO forces on heightened alert. Though fearing, but in the end seeing no attack forthwith, the Soviets also held their forces back as reason prevailed over paranoia. After Able Archer concluded, their fears were alleviated and both sides had, without truly knowing it at the time, averted a possible nuclear disaster. If U.S. forces had reacted differently, what could have occurred though? Perutz wouldn't know the full impact of his decision for many years, and after Andropov died not long after this incident, Ryan's importance was diminished but would remain in operation until 1991, even as U.S.-Soviet tensions relaxed under the new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. Ryan was not a crystal ball, and there was division among the Soviet intelligence community and leadership as to its utility as an indicator for attack. Yet still, during the confluence of many factors, Operation Ryan very well might have brought us to the threshold for nuclear annihilation.